The wind rolled gently over the red clay hills of Magnolia County, Georgia, where the fields stretched like old quilt patches under a pale October sky. The golden afternoon sun cast long shadows across the porch of a weather-beaten farmhouse that had stood for nearly a century. Paint peeled from its wooden siding, and the front steps creaked like old bones when Margaret Harper stepped down to check the mailbox. She was 74, slight of frame but steady in her step, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes the color of stormy dusk. Every day she followed the same rhythm: morning prayer, tending the garden, afternoon tea, and a quiet evening spent with her Bible and old records. Life had quieted after her husband, Frank, passed 10 years ago. Her daughter Rachel had left for New York years before that, chasing ambition and a world Margaret had only seen in magazines. But that afternoon, Margaret found a letter, not from the power company or the church or her cousin Lila, but from Rachel. The envelope bore a return address in Manhattan and smelled faintly of expensive perfume.
Inside, a crisp card read:
Dear Mom,
I'm coming home.
I want to talk, and I hope you'll let me stay a few days. There's something important I'd like to do, for you, for us. Love, Rachel. Margaret stood still on the porch, her fingers tightening around the envelope. It had been 12 years since Rachel last stepped foot in Magnolia County.
She hadn't comme fort Frances funeral.
There had been occasional phone calls, always rushed, often clipped, and only on birthdays or Christmas. Yet here she was, announcing her return without drama, just a few calm lines and a familiar signature. 2 days later, Rachel arrived. She stepped out of a sleek black rental car in heels too tall for gravel roads and a coat that didn't belong to the South's humid autumn. Her hair was glossy, lips red, sunglasses wide and dark like armor. Margaret walked out to meet her, wiping her hands on her apron. Well, Margaret said, voice steady, you look just like one of the magazine women. Rachel smiled faintly, removed her sunglasses, and for a moment, there was a flicker, just a flicker, of the girl Margaret remembered, gap-toothed at 9, full of sass at 16, and trembling when she left at 18. Hi Mom, Rachel said.
Thanks for letting me come.
Margaret nodded and held the door open. Let's not stand around catching flies. Come on in. There's still sweet tea if you remember what that is. Inside, the house smelled of lemon oil and cornbread. The same couch, same lace curtains, same faded photographs of ancestors in stiff collars and stern expressions. Rachel looked around with a soft exhale. I forgot how small it is, she said, not unkindly. Margaret didn't answer. She led Rachel to the kitchen table and poured tea into 2 mason jars. They sat. The silence was thick, but not hostile.
Just full.
Rachel cleared her throat. I know I've been gone a long time. Margaret sipped her tea.
Ich should veu comme sooner.
I know that too. Margaret looked out the window at the barn, where the roof sagged slightly.
Well, you're here now. That is what matters.
There was a pause. Then Rachel leaned forward, elbows on the table, her tone shifting to business. I've been doing well, Mom. I started my own consulting firm in New York. We handle real estate partnerships, mostly commercial. Lately, we've been expanding into rural markets. Margaret's brow furrowed slightly.
You mean like farm?
Like towns, Rachel said. Communities. Places with potential, like this one.
Margaret said nothing.
Rachel pressed on, her voice smooth, rehearsed. I've been thinking, this house, this land. It's beautiful, it's full of history. But it's also, well, underused. We could turn it into a retreat, a wellness getaway. Investors are interested in authentic, Southern-style escapes. Your home could be the centerpiece of something really special.
Margaret slowly set down her glass.
Rachel pulled out a folder from her leather bag. All I need is for you to sign a limited power of attorney. Just for financial matters related to the property.
ILL and everything.
You'll still live here, Mom. Nothing changes except we'll have income, upgrades, maybe even a proper healthcare fund. Margaret didn't reach for the folder. Her voice was calm, but firm.
You came all this way to talk business. Rachel hesitated.
No. I came to reconnect. But this is part of that.
You want to give something back.
Margaret studied her daughter. The polish, the charm, the practiced ease. She saw the girl she had raised, and also someone she didn't fully know anymore. I don't know much about contracts, Margaret said, but I know when someone's selling something.
Are you in trouble, Rachel? Rachel's eyes flashed. No. I'm not in trouble.
I'm offering you an opportunity.
Silence stretched again.
Margaret looked down at her hands, old, wrinkled, the veins like rivers. She thought of Frank building this house with his own hands. Thought of late nights nursing Rachel through measles, of planting the dogwood tree out front the day Rachel turned 5. She finally said, "Leave it on the table."
Il est look it over.
Rachel smiled, relieved. Thank you, Mom. Really. That night, Margaret sat on the porch with a blanket over her knees.
The star blinked above like distant lanterne.
She held the folder in her lap but didn't open it. Instead, she stared at the fields beyond, at the silhouette of the dogwood tree. She whispered, "Frank, I don't know if this is right. But maybe it's a way to keep her close." Inside, the light above the porch door glowed warmly. It had always stayed on at night, even when no one came. Just in case.
Just in case Soméon et Vercamome.
It was early November when the letter arrived. Plain envelope, government seal, folded neatly and impersonal like so many of life's unwelcome truths. Margaret Harper opened it with the same caution she reserved for snakes in the garden. Her eyes scanned the words, but it wasn't until the second reading that she truly grasped what it meant. Eviction notice. Her home, the one she and Frank had built board by board, was no longer hers. She sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Rachel had once spilled milk during spelling homework, and reread the letter. It cited new ownership, a transfer of deed to a development company based in Atlanta, and a 30-day window to vacate.
Heure en chouk.
She turned the envelope over, searching for mistake, an error in the address, a wrong name, but there it was, in cold typeface: Margaret E. Harper is no longer the legal owner of 227 Willow Creek Road. The folder Rachel had left sat untouched on the bookshelf. Margaret had signed a document inside it, just one page, not thinking much of it. Rachel had said it was for processing financial access and expediting approval. Margaret had trusted. She hadn't read the fine print. She hadn't thought she'd need to. She sat in silence for a long time, long after the afternoon light had shifted and the shadows had drawn across the floor like old ghosts. By nightfall, the town had heard.
In place like Magnolia County, secret never last.
At the gas station, folks murmured about Rachel Harper, the city girl with fancy heels, and poor old Margaret, bless her heart. At the diner, waitresses passed the story between coffee refills and slices of pecan pie. The sheriff came by the next day, not to arrest, just to check in. He stood awkwardly on the porch, hat in hand, not knowing whether to offer comfort or apology. "I heard," he said. "I don't know what's gone on, but if you need help, Margaret, well, you let us know." She nodded but said little. There was dignity in her silence, but also sorrow. A week later, a black SUV arrived. 2 men in suits stepped out and began taking photos of the property. Margaret watched from the window, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't confront them. She didn't scream. She simply waited until they left, then locked the door behind them as though it still mattered. That night, she made cornbread and black-eyed peas, the way Frank used to like. She sat at the table, eating slowly, methodically. She didn't cry. The next morning, she packed a suitcase. Just one. She took her Bible, Frank's wedding ring, an old photograph of Rachel as a baby, and a small hand-stitched quilt her grandmother had made. Then she called the First Baptist Church of Magnolia and asked if they still had that spare room for missionaries. The young pastor, Caleb Bennett, answered the phone. He remembered Margaret from Sunday services and youth fundraisers, from the pies she donated at the county fair. His voice was soft but certain. "We do," he said. "And it's yours if you want it." She arrived the next day, suitcase in hand, wearing her Sunday shoes. Pastor Caleb greeted her with a hug that felt just awkward enough to be sincere. "We'll fix up the back room," he said. "It's small, but quiet. You'll have privacy. And we'd be honored to have you." She nodded. "I don't need much." Life at the church was different. There was no porch swing, no dogwood tree, no familiar creaks in the floorboards at night. But there was warmth, in a different kind of way. Pastor Caleb brought her tea. The secretary brought muffins. A few of the congregation members came by with casseroles, awkwardly pretending not to know the full story. Margaret never explained. She didn't have to. Days passed into weeks. She helped in the church kitchen. She volunteered for Sunday school crafts. She sat quietly in the back pew during services, hands folded, lips moving silently to old hymns. No one mentioned Rachel.
No one dared.
Then one afternoon, as Margaret was watering the small garden behind the church, a familiar voice called out,
Und Maggie.
She turned to see a young man walking toward her, tall in jeans and a wrinkled Oxford shirt, holding a briefcase in one hand.
Aaron? She asked.
Aaron Reynolds, her late sister's boy, now a junior attorney in Savannah. He kissed her cheek and gave her a long hug. I heard, he said gently. About the house. About Rachel. Margaret nodded.
You should have known better.
No, ma'am, he said firmly. You shouldn't have had to. They sat together on a bench near the garden. Aaron opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. I looked into the deed transfer, he said. The signature they have on file, it doesn't match yours. Not legally, not technically. And the notarization date?
It's a Sunday.
Offices were closed. Margaret frowned. So it's invalid? Possibly. But it'll take a fight. Margaret looked away.
Un petit raid, Aaron. You understand.
But this isn't just about you. It's about what's right. You can walk away if you choose, but you deserve to make that choice knowing the truth. She didn't answer right away. She looked up at the church steeple against the fading sky. Later that evening, Margaret sat on the edge of her cot in the church's back room. In her hands, the eviction notice and Aaron's papers lay side by side. One spoke of loss.
The odeur of restitution.
She turned on the small bedside lamp. A bulb glowed, soft and steady. She took out the photograph of Rachel as a baby, wrapped in a blue blanket, mouth open in mid-cry, eyes wide like she was already looking toward some distant future.
Margaret whispered, I took tirez you better.
But maybe I still don't know who you've become. Then she folded the eviction notice carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and picked up the documents Aaron had given her. With hands both firm and fragile, she signed her name at the bottom of the affidavit. A witness to her own undoing. And perhaps, just perhaps, its unwinding. Aaron Reynolds had always admired his Aunt Margaret. When he was a child, she was the one who gave him books for Christmas instead of toy trucks, the one who showed up to his high school graduation when no one else could come. She had been a quiet presence in his life, consistent and comforting, like the ticking of an old kitchen clock. That was why, when he heard what had happened to her, he dropped everything in Savannah and drove the 2 hours west to Magnolia County. Now, sitting across from her in the church's modest office, Aaron unfolded a second file. He wore a tired suit, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled. His voice, though calm, carried the crisp cadence of a man used to legal argument. This is the power of attorney Rachel had you sign, he said. It wasn't limited like she claimed. It granted full authority to act in your name, including the right to sell property. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She said it was for financial processing, she murmured. Aaron nodded. And she took that trust and sold your house to a real estate holding company, RGM Enterprises. They flipped it immediately to a development group based in Atlanta.
The sale price?
Just under $500,000.
Margaret's briscogt. $500,000.
Yes, ma'am. And Rachel's name is listed as recipient of disbursement funds. For a moment, the room was still.
Dust in the shaft of sunlight coming through the blind.
Margaret didn't cry. She didn't gasp. Instead, she reached for her glasses, adjusted them, and looked down at the document as though it were a puzzle she had to solve. She really did it, she said softly. She sold it like it was nothing.
Aaron said nothing.
He knew better than to fill silences that belonged to someone else's grief. Margaret finally looked up. Can we undo it? Maybe. There are clear irregularities, signature mismatch, illegal notarization date, no independent witness. And if we can prove she acted in bad faith, we might nullify the contract entirely.
End the land.
If the court agrees to reverse the sale, it could revert back to your name. But it'll be a fight, Aunt Maggie. The developers have lawyers.
Rachel met tout.
Margaret stood, walked over to the window, and looked out at the churchyard. The wind stirred the branches of the dogwood trees planted in memory of fallen soldiers. Her voice was quiet when she spoke.
I don't want the money.
I don't even need the land. But I want it known that she lied. That I didn't give it away. That I wasn't a fool. Aaron stood beside her. Then let's do it. He filed the initial suit in the county courthouse a week later. It included allegations of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and misrepresentation of legal documents. The local paper caught wind of it. A small headline appeared in the Sunday edition: Magnolia matriarch sues daughter over historic home. People talked. Some offered support. Others whispered in the aisles at the grocery store. The preacher gave a sermon about forgiveness. Margaret sat in the third pew, her spine straight as a rail, hands clasped in her lap. But Margaret didn't seek pity. She moved through each day with the same quiet resolve she had always carried. She made soup for the Wednesday Bible group. She helped sew blankets for the hospital drive. And every night, she turned on a small light beside the church's side door, the same way she had once left the porch light on at home. Just in case, she told Pastor Caleb. She might still come back. Meanwhile, Aaron tracked down records, interviewed the notary who had supposedly signed the documents, who denied ever meeting Rachel, and uncovered communications between Rachel and a local agent who had helped facilitate the sale.
The evidence grew, piece by piece.
And with it, Margaret's case. Then came the letter. It arrived in early December, handwritten, folded into a plain envelope with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, looped, narrow, neat. Margaret sat alone in her room when she read it. The paper trembled slightly in her hand. Dear Mom.
I know what I've done.
I don't expect you to forgive me. Maybe I just needed to prove I could build something on my own, and instead I destroyed the only thing that ever truly mattered.
The money's almost gone.
The partners turned out to be liars, or maybe I just became one myself. I never meant to hurt you.
I tugged.
I don't know what I thought. I don't have the courage to come back, not yet. But I remember how the porch light always stayed on. If it's still there, if you still leave it on, maybe someday I'll find my way to it again. I'm sorry. Rachel.
Margaret read the letter 3 times.
She didn't weep. But when she folded it and placed it inside her Bible, her hands lingered over the page. That night, she sat with Pastor Caleb after the evening service. The church was quiet, the air tinged with pine from the wreaths hung in anticipation of Christmas. She wrote, Margaret said, simply. Caleb looked up. And?
She's lost.
But maybe not entirely. He nodded. Are you still moving forward with the case? Yes, she said.
Not for revenge.
For truth. And for her. So she knows there's a line you don't cross, not even with family.
Caleb studieur.
And if she does come back?
I'll be waiting, Margaret said.
But I'll still expect her to face what she's done. The following week, a court date was set for early January. Rachel didn't respond to the summons. Her address couldn't be verified. Her phone had been disconnected. She had disappeared as suddenly as she'd returned. But Margaret pressed on. She met with Aaron every few days. They went over timelines, witness lists, deposition options. The developers tried to settle, offering a small payout in exchange for silence, but Margaret refused. I won't be bought, she said. Not now. Not ever. The church stood behind her. Members showed up to meetings with casseroles and prayers. Even the gossip died down, replaced by a quiet respect. One Sunday morning, as Aaron reviewed a witness statement, Margaret handed him a small slip of paper. What's this? He asked. My statement, she said. It read, I trusted my daughter because I believed love protected against betrayal. I was wrong. But I will not be silent about what happened. I want the world to know that I did not give my life away, I had it taken. And still, I hope she finds her way back. Because that's what a mother does. She waits.
With the light on.
Aaron read it twice, then looked up at her.
It's perfect. No, Margaret said, standing.
It's honest.
That is enough.
And that night, she lit the church's porch light again. Not because Rachel deserved it, but because Margaret Harper still believed that the lost could find their way home, if someone kept a light burning. The courthouse in Magnolia County stood like a relic from another time: brick facade, white pillars, and a copper-domed clock that hadn't kept time in years. On the morning of January 12th, it was unusually busy. A few reporters had gathered near the steps, notebooks in hand, waiting for what was billed in the local paper as the trial of family and fortune. Margaret Harper arrived quietly. She wore a modest navy dress and a winter shawl draped across her shoulders. Pastor Caleb accompanied her, walking beside her with hands clasped behind his back like a respectful escort. Aaron met them at the door, briefcase in hand, his expression serious but calm. "She's here," he said low. Margaret didn't look up. "I didn't expect otherwise." Rachel sat inside the courtroom, flanked by a sharply dressed attorney who whispered into her ear as the judge entered. Her hair was tied back, her blazer crisp. But her eyes didn't shine the way they used to. There was tension around her mouth, the kind that forms after too many sleepless nights. When Margaret entered the room, their eyes met briefly. Rachel's lips parted slightly, as if to say something, but nothing came out. Judge Holloway, a tall, wiry man in his 60s, banged the gavel to start the hearing. The courtroom quieted as he read through the complaint: fraudulent transfer of property, breach of fiduciary duty, exploitation of an elderly person. Aaron began with a calm but firm opening statement. "This is not a case about money. It's about trust. It's about a daughter who took advantage of her mother's love to strip her of the only home she had ever known." Rachel's attorney countered smoothly. "My client acted with full authority, granted by a signed legal document. There is no evidence of coercion, no threats. This case is built on regret, not wrongdoing." Then the testimonies began. The notary public was the first witness. Under oath, he confirmed he had never met Rachel Harper and had not signed or witnessed any document on the date listed. "That was a Sunday," he said. "The office was closed. I was at church." Gasps stirred in the room. Next came a real estate agent who worked with Rachel during the sale. She testified that Rachel claimed her mother had no use for the house anymore and had given her full blessing to sell. When asked if she had ever spoken directly to Margaret, the agent admitted she had not. Margaret was called to the stand last. She walked slowly but with dignity. Sitting in the witness chair, she folded her hands and looked directly at the judge. "I raised Rachel on this land," she began. "Every board in that house, every tree planted, every meal cooked, it was all done with love. I never imagined that love would be used against me." She told the court how Rachel had returned after 12 years, talked of opportunity, asked her to sign a simple document without explanation. How she hadn't thought to question her own daughter. "I was foolish," Margaret admitted. "Not for trusting her, but for assuming she still saw this place as home. I signed because I believed we were rebuilding something between us. But all she wanted was what she could take." Aaron handed her a printed letter, Rachel's own handwritten apology, which had been authenticated and submitted into evidence. Margaret unfolded it, her hands trembling only slightly. "This is her handwriting," she said. "She admits what she did. Not to the court, maybe, but to me." The judge took the letter, read it silently, then looked toward Rachel. "Do you deny writing this?" he asked.
Rachel's eyes flickered.
Her lawyer leaned in, whispered something. Rachel shook her head once and spoke, barely audible. "I wrote it." The courtroom went still. For the first time since the hearing began, Margaret saw something break in her daughter's expression.
Not défiance. Not arrogance.
Just fatigue, and maybe something close to shame. Aaron stood for his closing. This case isn't just about recovering land. It's about drawing a line that says even love has limits. That trust, once betrayed, deserves justice. And that age, vulnerability, and faith in your own child should not be a weapon used against you. Rachel's attorney argued that the matter was one of poor communication, not criminal intent. That Margaret had signed willingly, and the sale had been legal by process, if not by sentiment. Judge Holloway adjourned to deliberate.
Margaret stepped outside the courtroom, into the cool winter air.
She sat on the courthouse bench, hands folded, eyes distant. Rachel remained inside, speaking quietly with her lawyer. 30 minutes later, the court reconvened.
Judge Holloway read the verdict.
Based on the evidence presented, including fraudulent notarization, lack of full disclosure, and the written acknowledgement of misrepresentation, the court rules in favor of the plaintiff.
The deed transfer is nullified.
Ownership of the property at 227 Willow Creek Road shall revert to Margaret Harper. Margaret didn't smile. She didn't even breathe for a moment. The judge continued. However, due to the resale of the property and subsequent commercial development, restitution will be financial rather than physical. A compensatory judgment in the amount of $410,000 is awarded to the plaintiff, to be paid by the defendant, Rachel Harper. Gasps, murmurs, and shifting seats followed. Margaret looked down at her hands. She hadn't expected to get anything back. She wasn't sure she even wanted it. But the truth, at least, was now on record. The judge looked toward Rachel. You are further barred from acting in any fiduciary or representative capacity for your mother, and any inheritance or legal transfer of her estate is now revoked pending further review. Rachel didn't speak. As people began to file out, Margaret stood and walked to the center aisle. For a moment, she paused near Rachel, who stood motionless, eyes focused on the floor. I didn't come here to punish you, Margaret said, her voice low. But I needed you to see what you did. To hear it said out loud. Rachel finally met her gaze. I did, she said, voice hoarse. And I'm sorry. Margaret nodded. You wrote that already. But words only go so far. She turned and walked away. Outside, the light had changed. The sky was soft with winter clouds. Aaron joined her on the steps. Well, he said quietly, you won.
Margaret shook her head.
I didn't lose. They stood together for a while, neither speaking. Later that night, back at the church, Margaret lit the small porch lamp again. She sat on the wooden bench beside the chapel, hands wrapped around a cup of warm tea. It wasn't the house she had lost, not really. It was the faith she'd once held without question. The trial had returned her dignity, but not her daughter. Still, the light stayed on. Because Margaret Harper believed in waiting, not passively, not blindly, but with the kind of strength only a mother can carry. And somewhere, far from Magnolia County, Rachel Harper lay awake in a hotel room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if that light still burned. It did. The days after the trial passed in slow, hushed rhythm. Magnolia County returned to its quiet routines: morning coffee at Earl's Diner, choir practice on Thursdays, Sunday sermons that hovered somewhere between comfort and conviction. The courthouse, which had briefly buzzed with drama, now stood dormant again, its hallways echoing only the sounds of clerks' shoes and aging radiators. For Margaret Harper, life at the church settled into something close to peace. She did not celebrate the verdict. There was no party, no announcement. She refused the interview requests that trickled in from state papers and community radio stations. When asked, she simply said, the court said what needed saying.
C'était enough.
She declined the money at first, over $400,000, deposited into an escrow account per the court's order. It sat untouched for weeks. Margaret told Pastor Caleb, I didn't fight for money. I just wanted the truth. But Caleb, ever the gentle voice of wisdom, reminded her, sometimes truth comes with consequences, Margaret. And sometimes it brings tools.
What you do with the money is up to you.
But don't let guilt keep it from doing some good. She thought about that.
Winter towed slowly into early spring.
Dogwoods began to bud. The air warmed just enough to open windows in the afternoon. And Margaret began to move forward, not fast, not with any grand gestures, but with the same steady hands that had once kneaded bread and rocked a crib in the dark. She used part of the settlement to rebuild the church's food pantry. The back wall had been cracked for years, patched with plywood and prayers. Now it stood firm, insulated and painted a warm beige. She purchased a new stove for the church kitchen, where she continued to make cornbread for Wednesday dinners. She funded scholarships for 3 local high school students to attend vocational programs in Macon. But perhaps the most personal use of the money came quietly, one morning in late March, when Margaret approached Pastor Caleb with an idea. I'd like to build something, she said. Not big.
Just a place.
Caleb tilted his head.
What kind of place? A house. A small one.
Not for me. For others. A refuge. She explained her vision, a small cottage behind the church, where women in transition, those escaping abuse, homelessness, or just needing to restart, could stay. She didn't want it to be sterile or clinical. She wanted it to feel like home. We'll call it the Porch Lighthouse, she said.
Appela Suisse the Light-Alwaison.
Caleb smiled. It sounds like your kind of gospel. Construction began in April. The community pitched in. Men from the congregation brought hammers and nails. Women brought curtains and casseroles. Even teenagers came after school to haul bricks and rake gravel. The project took just 6 weeks, and when it was finished, it stood like a promise: whitewood siding, a slanted roof, and a porch with 2 rocking chairs. Over the door, a small lamp glowed warmly each evening. Margaret didn't name herself in any of it. The plaque by the door read only, "For those who need a place to return. Light kept by love." One afternoon in May, as she was tending to the flower beds beside the cottage, Pastor Caleb joined her. He watched her plant marigolds with her thin, gloved hands, and said softly, "You know, Rachel would be proud of this." Margaret didn't stop working. Maybe. If she ever hears of it. She might.
Word Travel.
"I'm not doing it for her pride," Margaret said, sitting back on her heels. "But I hope she knows there's still something in her worth saving." Caleb nodded, quiet. "Do you think she'll come back?" Margaret paused, then looked toward the road beyond the church fence. "I don't know," she said, "but I still turn the light on." That night, as dusk fell over Magnolia County, Margaret sat on the chapel's front steps, sipping chamomile tea. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. She thought of Rachel, not as the polished woman in a courtroom, but as a girl in muddy overalls, laughing as she ran through a sprinkler in the yard. She remembered the scraped knees, the bad report cards, the stubborn pride. And she remembered the good things too, how Rachel had once spent all her allowance on buying Margaret a ceramic angel at a church bazaar when she was 9. She didn't hold on to anger. Not anymore. There was sadness, yes. There was disappointment. But also space for change, for return, for grace. Inside the church, the hallway light flickered. She rose slowly, walked to the back of the chapel, and flipped the switch beside the door. The porch light clicked on. It glowed softly against the white wood, casting an arc of warmth into the cooling air. Across the state, in a rundown motel outside Savannah, Rachel Harper sat on the edge of a lumpy mattress, watching the television flicker silently. She held her phone, thumb hovering over the screen, staring at her mother's number. It was still saved. She hadn't deleted it. She had seen the article. A friend from law school had texted her a link: "Widowed woman builds refuge after court battle with daughter." The article was respectful, light on details, but the photo said enough. Her mother, older now, standing in front of a modest white house with flowers at her feet and the sky wide behind her. Rachel had read it twice. Then folded the phone and stared out the window. The next morning, Margaret found a letter in the mailbox, no return address, postmarked from Chatham County. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "I don't deserve forgiveness. But I saw the light. And I'm still walking toward it." Ah. Margaret didn't cry. She didn't smile either. But she held the letter for a long time, fingers pressed gently against the ink like it might fade if she let go. That night, she didn't just turn on the chapel porch light. She lit the lamp at the new cottage too. And when a little girl from the neighborhood asked her, "Why are there 2 lights now, Miss Margaret?" she answered without hesitation. "One is for the people who left," she said. "And the other is for the ones who are finding their way back." Because light wasn't just for seeing. It was for guiding. For promising that even when you couldn't see home yet, it was still there waiting.
Stider, burning softly.
Summer came to Magnolia County with its usual symphony, cicadas buzzing in the tall pines, the low hum of lawnmowers, and the distant bark of dogs chasing fireflies through heat-thick evenings. Life moved gently around the church grounds, where Margaret Harper continued her quiet rhythm. But something had shifted. The Porch Lighthouse now had its first resident, a young woman named Grace, just 19, recently released from a shelter in Macon. Margaret never asked about her past, only offered her a clean bed, warm meals, and a listening ear when Grace was ready. The girl, still wary, mostly stayed inside, reading or tending the small herb garden out back. Margaret often left short notes on Grace's door. "Fresh cornbread in the kitchen. Window fan fixed, don't forget to unplug before rain. No need to hurry healing." Grace responded with small gestures. A washed dish left in the drying rack. A folded blanket on the porch swing.
One day, she left a wildflower on Margaret's windowsill. No note, juste color.
But even as this quiet connection bloomed, another presence lingered. Rachel. Since the brief letter Rachel had sent weeks earlier, I saw the light. I'm still walking toward it. Nothing more had come. No phone call.
No return address.
Margaret didn't press. She didn't ask Caleb or Aaron to search. She believed people had to come back on their own.
Pushing could drive them deeper into the dark.
Still, every morning, Margaret walked the dusty half-mile road from the church to the county letterbox. She claimed it was for exercise, but Caleb knew better. You're waiting for another letter, he said one morning, walking beside her. Margaret didn't deny it. Hope isn't foolish. It's discipline. At the box, she turned the key, pulled open the small steel door. Empty. They walked back in silence, the gravel crunching beneath their shoes. Pastor Caleb spoke only once more, just as they reached the chapel steps. Do you think she regrets it? He asked. Margaret looked up at the rising sun. I think she doesn't know how to come back. Regret's the easy part. Return takes more than sorrow.
It takes courage.
That night, Margaret sat on the chapel's back steps. Grace joined her, holding a chipped mug of tea. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. After a while, Grace asked, voice quiet, do you think people can really change? Margaret didn't answer immediately. She took a sip of tea, watching the fireflies. I think change doesn't happen all at once, she said. It happens in small choices.
The can-one-six.
Like choosing not to lie. Like showing up, even when you're afraid you won't be welcomed. Grace looked down. My mom said I'd never be more than what I came from. Margaret turned to her, voice gentle but sure. Then your mother was wrong. Grace didn't respond, but she stayed sitting long after her tea had gone cold.
3 days later, another letter came. Margaret walked to the box alone that morning.
The heat had arrived early, and sweat already traced her temples beneath her straw hat. Inside the box, amid the usual flyers and bills, was a pale yellow envelope.
No name.
No stamp. Hand-delivered. Back at the church, she opened it slowly, carefully, as if it might break apart. Mom.
I was in Magnolia last night.
I didn't come up the driveway. I couldn't. I sat in a car on the road and watched the porch lights. Both of them. I thought about getting out. I almost did. But something held me back. It's not guilt anymore. It's shame. And I know that's mine to carry. I don't even know what I'd say if I saw you. What do you say to a mother whose heart you broke? Whose trust you sold? But I saw the light. And for now, that's enough. I wanted you to know I was close.
That I see you.
That I'm not done walking. Ah.
Margaret folded the letter slowly.
There were no tears.
Just stillness.
She pressed the envelope into the center of her Bible, beside the first letter, and whispered something only the pages heard. That afternoon, she made lemonade and took 2 glasses to the porch. She set one beside the empty rocker across from her. Grace, watching from the chapel window, saw her do it and said nothing. 2 days later, Grace came into the kitchen holding another envelope. This was under the garden gate, she said. Margaret opened it carefully. I remembered the blueberry pie. How you used to sing while you rolled the dough. That made me stop crying once when I scraped my knee.
I remembered your rang.
How steady they were. How you never raised your voice, even when I deserved it. I don't know if I deserve to be forgiven. But I remember you. And I want to come home. If you'll have me. Margaret placed the letter down, walked outside, and stood on the porch for a long moment. Then she opened the door to the small linen closet and pulled out a fresh towel, a pair of old pajamas, and the blue quilt Rachel had slept under as a child. She made up the guest bed in the chapel annex, simple, clean, waiting. That night, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. Thunder rolled in the distance, and lightning flashed beyond the trees. Margaret lit the porch light, then the lamp outside the porch lighthouse. Then she lit one more, an old lantern, once used in the barn, now hanging from the side of the chapel. Grace watched her through the window. How many lights does one house need?
Margaret Smiled, just a little.
As many as it takes.
By midnight, the rain had begun. Soft at first, then heavy, then a steady rhythm against the windows.
Margaret didn't sleep. She sat in her chair, Bible on her lap, glasses folded beside her. A knock came at the chapel door just after 2. She rose slowly, heart beating in a rhythm too loud for the silence around her. When she opened the door, Rachel stood there, soaked from the rain, hair plastered to her cheeks, eyes wide and red-rimmed. "I don't have anything left," Rachel whispered. "No job. No place. No plan." Margaret reached out, took her daughter's hand, and guided her inside. "You have a name," she said. "You have breath. You have a light to walk toward." Rachel cried then, not a dramatic cry, but the kind that comes from deep within, where the ache has sat for too long. Margaret held her, the way she had held her as a child after bad dreams, as a teenager after heartbreak, as a mother when there was nothing else to do but be present. Grace stood at the end of the hallway, watching quietly. She didn't say a word. She only stepped into the kitchen and turned on one more light. Because that night, the lights weren't just symbols. They were beacons. They were welcome signs. They were the truth made visible. And under those lights, soaked in the scent of rain and grace, a daughter came home. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The air was thick with the earthy scent of wet soil and magnolia petals knocked loose by the wind.
The clouds parted slowly, like curtains drawn back to reveal a stage reset overnight.
And in the quiet dawn, Rachel Harper stood barefoot in the backyard of the chapel, staring at the horizon as if trying to orient herself in a life she no longer recognized. Inside, Margaret was already awake, stirring oatmeal in the church kitchen. She moved slowly, the way one does after something significant has cracked open, something tender and unfinished. She didn't speak when Rachel entered, only gestured to the table. A bowl. A cup of tea.
Nothing dramatic.
No ceremony. Rachel sat and began to eat, each bite slow, deliberate, as though rediscovering the taste of simplicity. After a while, she spoke. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Margaret didn't look up from her cup. "Eat. Rest. Then help where you can. That's it. That's enough for today." Rachel nodded and kept eating. She didn't argue, didn't push for more. It was the first time in years she let someone else set the pace. Over the next few days, Rachel kept to herself. She slept in the chapel annex, helped clean dishes after community meals, swept the chapel steps, and walked the perimeter of the grounds at sunset. She didn't speak of New York, or the lawsuit, or the money. And Margaret didn't ask. Silence became a kind of scaffold they rebuilt around. Grace watched from a quiet distance. At first, she was wary. She had overheard enough of the town gossip to know who Rachel Harper was. But Margaret treated them the same, firmly, gently, without judgment. Grace noticed how Rachel flinched at kindness, the way she paused before accepting anything freely given. She understood that look. She had worn it too. One afternoon, Margaret found them both in the garden. Grace was watering the rosemary, and Rachel was weeding the edge of the marigold bed. Margaret stood watching for a moment before speaking. "This was Frank's garden," she said. "He used to grow tomatoes so big they'd split before we picked them." Rachel didn't look up.
Il remembait.
"He used to tell me they were only sweet because I sang to them." Margaret smiled faintly. "You did sing a lot back then."
I don't anymore. You might again.
Grace glanced at Rachel, then back at the plants.
Everything grows better when you talk to it.
Margaret looked between them. Two women, both broken in different ways, both sowing something new. It wasn't healing yet, but it was the shape of it. Later that week, Rachel offered to repaint the inside of the porch lighthouse. The summer humidity had warped the trim, and the walls needed brightening. She worked for hours, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. Grace helped her tape the edges and climbed a ladder to reach the corners. In those quiet moments, words began to pass between them. "You were in New York?" Grace asked, eyes on the paintbrush.
15 years.
"I thought it'd fix everything." "Did it?"
Rachel shook her head.
"It just made the cracks easier to ignore." They didn't say much more, but something passed between them.
Understanding without details.
That weekend, A small service was held at the chapel to dedicate the garden and the newly completed porch lighthouse. It was simple, no media, no grand speeches.
Just a neighbor, fold d'un chair, lemonade, and a choir of children singing softly.
Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. Pastor Caleb invited her to speak, but she declined. Instead, she handed Rachel a folded piece of paper and stepped back. Rachel looked at her, startled. Margaret gave no explanation, only a slight nod. Heart-pounding, Rachel stepped up to the front, unfolded the paper, and read. When I was a child, I thought home was a place. A porch.
A dog barking. A modeur calling me in dusk.
But home is not wood or land. It's a person who leaves the light on even when you've gone too far. She paused. I spent years chasing what I thought was success. I got lost. I hurt people. I broke trust that may never fully mend. But I am here now, not because I deserve forgiveness, but because I'm trying to remember how to be whole. Silence followed. Then soft applause. Margaret didn't smile, but her eyes were wet. Not with pride, exactly. With relief, maybe. With a fragile kind of hope. The next morning, Margaret found Rachel in the garden again, standing beside the dogwood tree that had survived every storm since Frank planted it the year Rachel was born. Rachel held something small in her hand. A ring box. Inside was the plain silver band Margaret had once worn on her chain, Frank's wedding ring. I pawned it years ago, Rachel said. I didn't think I'd ever see it again. But after the court ruling, I used what was left to find it. Tracked it down. Bought it back. Margaret took the box in her hands and closed it without opening it. You brought it home, she said.
T'étais ce neuf.
They didn't hug. They didn't need to. That night, as fireflies rose from the grass like scattered stars, Rachel and Grace sat on the chapel steps. Margaret joined them after sunset, carrying 3 mugs of tea. They didn't talk much. Just sat.
A brise tirait the porch light.
The house behind them glowed gently, windows warm with lamplight. Tomorrow, Margaret said, we'll start on the vegetable beds. There's room for green beans if we tear out that patch of crabgrass.
Rachel logued. You never stop planning, do you?
Margaret sipped her tea. Hope is work. Same as gardening. You keep tending, even when nothing blooms for a while. Grace leaned back against the post.
What if nothing ever grows?
Margaret looked up at the night sky. Then we try again next season. They sat like that for a long while, 3 women, each carrying their own scars, their own quiet stories. No one said the word family, but the shape of it hung in the air, tentative and possible. And all around them, under the porch lights and the open sky, the soil waited. Not as a grave, but as a beginning. Summer deepened over Magnolia County. The days grew long and heavy, and the sound of cicadas filled the air like static on an old radio. Life at the chapel settled into a gentle rhythm. The porch lighthouse now had a garden of its own, with green beans climbing wooden stakes, squash blossoming in yellow bursts, and tomatoes swelling on the vine. Margaret oversaw it all with quiet satisfaction, her straw hat shading her face as she worked beside Rachel and Grace each morning. It was Rachel who noticed the shift first, how her hands no longer trembled when she reached for a trowel, how her voice didn't tighten when she greeted strangers from town. People no longer stared when she went into the hardware store. A few even nodded, called her name without contempt. One morning, Earl, the diner owner, offered her a coffee on the house and said, "You're looking more like your mama every day." Rachel didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both, silently, into the cup she cradled between her palms. At the church, Pastor Caleb continued to treat her with the same calm respect he gave everyone. Never once did he bring up the lawsuit, the scandal, or the letters. But one afternoon, as they watered the roses by the chapel steps, he asked, "Are you staying?" Rachel looked up from the hose. "I don't know yet." He nodded. "Well, the road's still open either way." She carried those words with her for days.
The road is still open.
It was both a comfort and a burden. Because it meant she had a choice, and choice meant responsibility. That week, Rachel received a call from a contact in Atlanta. An old colleague from her real estate days had heard she was back in Georgia and wanted to meet. "Just coffee," he said. "Talk."
Mais consulting opportunity. Low-key, flexible.
The temptation stirred something in her, a reminder of who she had been, who she might still be. But it also reminded her of what had nearly destroyed her. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she went to the chapel's attic, where old furniture and forgotten boxes gathered dust. There she found what she was looking for, a leather-bound photo album Margaret had once kept on the living room bookshelf. She carried it down to the porch and flipped through it slowly. There was her 8th birthday party under the dogwood tree. Her high school graduation in that too big red gown.
Pictures of Frank Amring the Porcherei, Margaret Holding à Piat the County Fair.
In one photo, Rachel was 5, sitting on Margaret's lap, holding a jar of fireflies and grinning with her whole face. Rachel ran her fingers over the picture, then closed the book and pressed it to her chest. She didn't cry. She just sat very still, as if trying to feel the weight of a life she had spent so long running from. That evening, Rachel helped Grace prepare dinner for the small group of women now coming to the chapel for weekly community meals. What had begun as a one-woman project was slowly becoming something bigger. Word had spread about the Porch Lighthouse. A woman from the next county asked if she could stay for a few nights. Another came with her 2 children, hoping for a safe place to rest before moving on. Margaret took them all in with her steady grace, no questions asked. After dinner, when the women had left and the dishes were done, Grace pulled Rachel aside. "You're good at this," she said. "At what?" "At being here. Helping." Rachel looked away. "It doesn't make up for what I did."
Grace shrugged.
"Maybe not. But it's more than most people do."
L'été, Rachel walked the garden alone.
The night was warm, but not heavy.
Firefly blinked between the tomato vines.
She stopped by the dogwood tree, placed her palm on the rough bark, and whispered, "I think I'm ready." The next morning, she found Margaret on the porch, sipping tea. "I got a call from Atlanta," Rachel said. "Someone I used to work with. Wants to meet. Maybe offer me a job." Margaret didn't look up.
"Do you want it?" "I don't know.
I miss the work. But not the pressure. Not the way it made me feel, hungry all the time. Like I could never stop moving or I'd fall behind." Margaret set her cup down. Sometimes going back means standing still first.
Rachel sat beside her.
"I've been thinking about staying." Margaret turned to her. "Here? At the chapel? I want to help. Not just for now. For real. I want to work with Grace, expand the house. Maybe even start a vocational program. Teach some of the women how to run small businesses. I know it won't fix everything, but it's something." Margaret reached out, placed her hand over Rachel's. "You don't have to fix everything. Just do the next right thing." Rachel nodded. "And if I mess up again?" "Then you get back up. And you keep the light on." 2 weeks later, Rachel drove to Atlanta, not to accept a job, but to close the last account in her name from the company she had helped start. She met with her former colleague, returned keys, declined the offer. When he asked what she planned to do next, she said simply, "Start over."
Sommière honnête.
Back in Magnolia, the church congregation voted to approve the expansion of the Porch Lighthouse. Margaret stepped back from daily management, handing more responsibility to Rachel and Grace. A local nonprofit offered to sponsor a second cottage. Volunteers returned to help lay foundation stones. Rachel led the planning meetings, drafted blueprints, coordinated supplies. She worked late into the night sometimes, writing proposals at the kitchen table, her hair pulled up, sleeves rolled, the old steadiness returning to her hands. One night, as Margaret passed her on the porch, she paused. "You look like your father when you work like that," she said. Rachel smiled. "He was always building something." Margaret nodded.
"So are you."
They stood quietly for a while. Then Rachel said, "You never really gave up on me, did you?" "I wanted to," Margaret admitted. "But love doesn't always obey logic." Rachel looked out into the dark yard, where porch lights glowed warm across the grass. "Then I guess I owe everything to that one light." Margaret shook her head. "No. You owe it to the choice you made when you turned around." Rachel breathed deeply, feeling the air settle in her chest, not like weight, but like roots. Because it was no longer about returning. It was about remaining. About choosing to stay to build, to plant something that might outlast her mistakes. And all around her, Magnolia County bloomed. The first frost came early that year. One crisp October morning, Margaret stepped out onto the chapel porch to find the grass glistening with a thin layer of silver. The dogwood tree stood bare now, its last leaves fallen during the night, carpeting the ground like little flames. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and breathed in the cold, clean air. Change had come again, as it always did. But this time, it wasn't unwelcome. Inside the porch lighthouse, the wood stove crackled softly. Rachel stood by the window, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, her eyes focused on the garden rose now resting beneath the frost. Beside her, Grace was folding laundry, humming under her breath. The small home had grown busier over the past few months. 2 new residents, 1 toddler, and a woman who had arrived with nothing but a backpack and a name stitched onto the inside of her jacket. Rachel had taken to the work naturally. She organized schedules, coordinated donations, managed a rotating roster of volunteers from the church and the local high school. She was no longer just helping. She was leading. One morning, while painting the porch railing, Grace looked up and said, "You know, people in town are starting to say your name without a pause." Rachel blinked.
Without a pause.
You know, that pause. The one they used to take, like they were remembering something bad before they said it. I think they're forgetting the pause. Rachel smiled, just a little. I'm not sure I want them to forget. Just, let it be one part of the story, not the whole. Grace dipped her brush back into the paint.
You're building something better now.
Rachel didn't answer. But in her heart, she knew it was true.
Not just a building.
A place. A rhythm. A new inheritance, not passed down, but created through hours, service, and steady repentance. Margaret, meanwhile, had grown quieter. Not withdrawn, but more still. She moved slower, rested more. Sometimes, Rachel would find her dozing on the chapel bench, Bible in her lap, lips parted in mid-hymn. The years were catching up, and everyone felt it. One evening, after dinner, Rachel found her mother in the old garden beside the chapel. She was kneeling, hands in the soil, planting bulbs. Isn't it too late in the season? Rachel asked gently. Margaret smiled without looking up. These'll sleep through winter. Come spring, they'll wake. Rachel crouched beside her. You still believe in next season? I always have. There was a pause. Then Rachel said, I think I'm ready to take over. Fully. Margaret looked at her daughter, eyes clear despite the lines around them. You already have. Rachel nodded, emotions rising unexpectedly in her chest. I want you to rest.
Not disappear, juste reste.
You've held this place long enough. Margaret patted the earth around the bulbs.
Then promise me you'll keep the light on.
I will. And not just for others.
For yourself, too. Rachel blinked. For myself.
There will be days, Margaret said, standing slowly, when the world will dim around you. You'll doubt what you're doing. You'll want to run. On those days, don't forget to light your own way back. Rachel helped her up. I won't forget. That night, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, sorting donation forms, when she came across the original plans Margaret had drawn for the porch lighthouse. They were handwritten, a little shaky in the margins, but full of care. At the bottom of the page, beneath the proposed dimensions and notes on pantry shelves, were 4 words, underlined twice.
A home, not shelter.
Rachel stared at them for a long time. The next morning, she met with Pastor Caleb to discuss expansion. They had enough donations to start building a second cottage. Rachel proposed a new idea, a community workshop, a place where the residents could learn carpentry, sewing, basic business skills, whatever they needed to stand on their own. Caleb smiled. That sounds like your mother. It's also me, Rachel said. Finally. The church board approved the proposal within a week. Construction began before Thanksgiving. This time, Rachel didn't just coordinate, she worked. Hammer in hand, paint on her sleeves, splinters under her nails. Grace joked she was harder on the volunteers than anyone else.
You run this place like a ship. Rachel logged.
I've been in enough sinking ones to know what to fix. As winter approached, the new workshop neared completion. Inside, Rachel set up shelves with donated supplies: thread, fabric, tools, wood planks, used laptops. She wrote letters to local schools and businesses, inviting them to participate. A retired mechanic offered to teach a class on small engine repair. A local cafe owner volunteered to run a baking skills day. One evening, Grace stepped into the workshop and said, "You've turned this place into a garden." Rachel looked around at the sawdust, the tools, the chalkboard with its messy schedule. A garden.
Of second chance.
Outside, Margaret watched through the window, her breath fogging the glass. She saw the way Rachel moved, confident, calm, rooted. She thought of Frank, of the years they'd spent building the house that no longer stood. But what stood now was just as real, just as full of love. And when she turned back toward the chapel porch, she passed the old lantern still hanging beside the door. She reached up, lit the flame, and smiled. Later that week, the first snow came. It was light, just a dusting, enough to paint the rooftops and quiet the ground. Rachel stepped outside that morning, hands in her coat pockets, and stood watching the flurries drift. She looked at the glowing windows of the cottages, at the soft footprints leading from the porch to the garden, and then back to the workshop. It wasn't perfect. There were still struggles. A woman had relapsed and left suddenly. Another resident had to be taken to the hospital for a panic attack. But they had come back from each hardship. Together. Rachel pulled out her phone and opened a blank page in her notes app. She typed, "What grows in quiet is often strongest.
What begins in darkness reach for the light.
What breaks can also rebuild." She saved it, unsure if it would become a mission statement, a poem, or just a reminder. Behind her, the chapel bell rang noon. And she realized, as she turned toward the sound, that she no longer felt like a visitor. She had come home, yes. But more than that. She had stayed. By the time spring returned to Magnolia County, everything had changed, slowly, gently, and completely. The cherry blossoms along Willow Creek bloomed early that year, scattering soft pink petals across the gravel roads and porch railings like blessings left by unseen hands. The workshop beside the porch lighthouse was open daily now, humming with the soft rhythm of hands making, fixing, learning. A new cottage had been completed, painted a pale yellow, with white trim and a small front porch. Its lamp glowed every night, just like the others.
Margaret Harper had grown fraîlée over the winter.
Her movements were slower, her naps longer, her silences deeper. But her mind remained sharp, her voice clear, and her presence steady as ever. She still woke with the sun, still folded towels with corners lined up, still reminded Rachel to water the zinnias properly, not just splash and go. She had, however, begun to write more, letters mostly. Some were never sent. Others were delivered quietly, slipped under doors or tucked into pockets. She wrote to old friends, to Rachel, to Grace, to women who had passed through the porch lighthouse and moved on. Her handwriting had become more fragile, but her words were strong. One morning, Rachel found a letter on the kitchen table addressed to her, sealed with the floral sticker Margaret always used. Inside, in careful cursive, were the words, "My Rachel. You once asked me how I never gave up on you. The truth is, I did, many times.
I gave up in my heart, in my thoughts, in my fear.
But never in my soul. A mother's soul holds its own kind of light, one that doesn't flicker with the wind.
It just way.
Now I see that same light in you. You've become the keeper of it, not just for me, or for this place, but for others who don't yet know they'll need it. That's the legacy worth leaving.
Keep the light on.
Always. Love. Mom." Rachel read the letter twice, then folded it gently and placed it in her coat pocket. She walked out to the edge of the property where the dogwood tree stood, just beginning to bud again. She sat beneath it, feeling the roots press up from the soil beneath her, and cried, quietly without shame. Later that week, Margaret fell ill. It wasn't dramatic.
No ambulance, no urgent shooting. Just a soft descent into sleepiness, a retreat from the outer world.
She stayed in her small room at the back of the chapel, with a view of the garden and the chapel bell through the window. Rachel moved into the room next door, checking on her every hour. Grace sat with her during the evenings, reading aloud from the Psalms, though Margaret rarely spoke. The women in the house left small notes outside her door. One wrote, "Thank you for believing when I couldn't."
Another, "Because of you, my doctor sleeps safe at night."
The notes became their own kind of prayer. One Sunday morning in late April, just after sunrise, Margaret passed away quietly in her sleep. Rachel found her with one hand resting on her Bible, the other curled against her chest. Her expression was peaceful, lips curved in the hint of a smile. The entire town came to the funeral. The chapel was filled beyond capacity, pews packed, people standing along the walls, the porch full. Pastor Caleb led the service, his voice steady even when his eyes misted. Grace read a passage Margaret had once underlined in thick blue pen: "Do not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time you will reap a harvest if you do not give up." Then Rachel stood. She wasn't wearing black. She wore a dress Margaret had sewn decades ago, blue with tiny white buttons and soft stitching around the cuffs. Her voice did not tremble when she spoke. "My mother taught me that grace is not softness. It is strength held in restraint. It is truth spoken without harm." She loved with a discipline that most of us can't imagine. And when I left, when I betrayed her trust, when I became someone she didn't recognize, she waited. She kept the light on. She paused, looked toward the back window where sunlight spilled through. "I thought I was walking away forever. But what she built brought me home, not with guilt, but with invitation. And now I will keep that light on, for every daughter, every mother, every wanderer who needs to find their way back." That night, after the guests had gone and the chapel was quiet, Rachel stepped outside alone.
The star above Magnolia kunti shimmered like scattered glass.
She lit every porch lamp on the property, the original lantern at the chapel door, the lamp at the porch lighthouse, the soft golden globe above the new cottage, and the workshop light, which flickered once before warming to life. Then she walked to the edge of the garden, where a small bench now stood beneath the dogwood tree. Grace joined her after a while, carrying 2 cups of tea. She would have loved the service, Grace said softly. She would have fussed about all the people coming without RSVPing. They laughed, quietly. Grace looked around. "What now?" "We keep going," Rachel said.
We grow the garden.
We build another house if we can. We help the next woman who knocks on the door. And if no one knocks? Rachel looked up at the light burning in the window.
We still keep it on.
The next day, Rachel opened a new file on her laptop. At the top, she typed, "The Porch Light Foundation." Below it, she began to draft a proposal, a network of small homes in rural towns across Georgia, modeled after the Magnolia Chapel. Places of refuge, places of healing. She reached out to former donors, applied for grants, and called Aaron, who now worked in Atlanta, to help with the legal logistics. Momentum built quickly. Former residents wrote letters of support. Local newspapers ran stories. A filmmaker visited to shoot a documentary. Rachel found herself speaking at women's shelters, high school assemblies, and small-town fundraisers. But no matter how far she traveled, she always came home to Magnolia, to the chapel, to the house with the lights. Years passed. Grace eventually moved on, enrolling in a college program for counseling. A new woman took her place, and then another. The porch lighthouse remained open, full, alive. Rachel stayed. Not because she couldn't leave, but because she no longer needed to. One evening, decades later, an older Rachel sat on the same porch where Margaret had once waited. A young woman approached, hesitant, clutching a backpack. "I heard this is a place where people can start over," she said. Rachel nodded. "It is. Come in. We'll get you something warm." The woman paused. "Do I have to believe in anything?" Rachel smiled. "Just believe that you belong." She held the door open. And behind her, the light still burned.